There is a specific kind of quiet that happens before a crisis, not silence. People are still talking, stores are still open, gas stations are still lit up, but something underneath changes. Prices move in ways that feel slightly wrong. A shelf that used to be full is not quite full anymore. A neighbor mentions something offhand, something they heard, something they are not sure about. And most people look at that quiet and decide it means nothing. The people who prepared for the last major crisis did not start when the news confirmed something was wrong. They started 2 weeks before the news caught up to reality. That is not a coincidence. That is not luck. That is a specific kind of attention most families never develop until the moment they wish they had. This video is about 9 things. 9 items that sound ordinary on a calm Tuesday morning, but become something completely different when the situation changes. Not exotic gear, not military supplies, not a bunker or a generator you can barely afford. 9 things that are sitting in a store right now, available at normal prices, waiting for the kind of person who pays attention. And by the time we reach number 1, you may realize that the most critical item in a crisis was never the one anyone expected. The United States alone experiences an average of over 100 significant power outages per year, affecting at least 50,000 customers. That number has climbed every decade. In 2021, the Texas grid failure left over 4 million homes without power in temperatures that dropped below zero. People died not because they lacked survival gear, but because they lacked the simple things: bottled water, warmth, light, food that did not require a stove. The gap between surviving and suffering was often less than $30 worth of items that most families simply did not have. What follows is not a list of fears. It is a list of options. The families who had these things did not panic. They were inconvenienced. The families who did not have them discovered, in real time, how fragile the life they had built actually was. Starting at number 9. Number 9 is something that sits in every hardware store and most grocery stores and has a shelf life that most people never bother to read. Emergency candles, not birthday candles, not decorative wax, real emergency candles. The long-burning kind designed to last 8 to 10 hours per unit, sometimes more. This matters more than most people initially assume, and the reason comes down to a very specific psychological problem that happens in the first hours of any power outage. When the lights go out, the average American household reaches for their phone. The phone becomes a flashlight. The phone becomes a clock. The phone becomes the only connection to information, and within 12 hours, the phone battery begins to matter in a way that feels quietly terrifying. Every lumen of light pulled from a phone screen is battery life that cannot go toward communication, toward checking emergency alerts, toward calling someone who matters. Emergency candles remove that equation entirely. They are light that costs nothing after the initial purchase. They require no charging, no battery, no wireless signal. They exist independently of every system that has just failed. There is something else that candles do that no flashlight does. They create warmth, not enough to heat a room, but enough to make a cold space feel slightly less abandoned. In the Texas freeze of 2021, families who had candles reported something that sounds almost embarrassing to say out loud. The candles made things feel more manageable, not warmer in a measurable way, more manageable in a psychological way. Light that flickers is still light. In a dark house with scared children, that distinction matters enormously. The mistake most people make with candles is buying them as an afterthought, grabbing 2 or 3 and calling it done. The right quantity for a prepared household is enough to run at least 2 candles simultaneously for 5 to 7 days without running out. Do not store them near heat sources. Do not store them with matches you have not tested, and always pair them with a fire-safe surface and a basic understanding of candle safety. Open flames in a stressed household are a real risk that deserves real respect. The candle does not need to be romantic or beautiful. It just needs to exist when the switch no longer works. That sounds small. It is not small. Number 8 is something that disappears from store shelves within the first 48 hours of any declared emergency, and almost never gets mentioned in basic preparedness lists, because most people assume they already have enough. They do not. The item is disposable plates and disposable cups. This sounds almost embarrassing to include, but follow the logic to its honest conclusion. A serious power outage means no dishwasher. It often means limited water, because municipal water systems depend on electric pumps, and those pumps eventually struggle or fail during extended outages. And when water becomes something you are measuring and conserving rather than running freely from a tap, washing dishes becomes a choice between sanitation and survival. Using a gallon of precious stored water to wash the same plate 4 times in a row is not a crisis decision anyone should have to make. Disposable plates and cups allow a family to eat with full sanitation, to drink without contamination risk, and to preserve every drop of stored water for drinking and medical needs. They weigh almost nothing. They store flat. They cost very little per unit. And when a family is already managing stress, food anxiety, and limited light, eliminating the psychological burden of managing dishes is genuinely significant. The data from FEMA's own preparedness reports consistently shows that families underestimate water consumption during emergencies. The standard recommendation is 1 gallon per person per day, and that does not account for cooking, cleaning, or hygiene. A family of 4 using that standard over 7 days needs 28 gallons. Most families have 0 stored gallons. Adding dishwashing into that calculation is a variable that smart families simply remove. Disposable items solve a problem that sounds trivial right up until the moment it is not. Number 7. This one sits at the intersection of medicine, comfort, and survival, and gets ignored because it does not feel urgent in a normal week. Electrolyte packets, the kind you add to water. Not sports drinks that require refrigeration and contain sugar that becomes a problem in large quantities. Small, sealed, powdered packets designed to maintain hydration when the body is under stress. Here is the medical reality that most people do not know. During a crisis, whether that is a blackout, a hurricane, an illness outbreak, or an extended disruption of normal life, the human body loses electrolytes faster than during normal daily activity. Stress activates the body's cortisol response. Physical exertion increases during situations that require manual tasks. Carrying water, moving supplies, securing windows, sleeping in uncomfortable positions. Dehydration in these situations does not just mean thirst. It means confusion, headaches, muscle cramps, impaired decision-making at precisely the moment when clear thinking is most critical. The American Red Cross documented during the response to Hurricane Harvey in 2017 that a significant number of medical calls were not for trauma. They were for dehydration-related symptoms in adults who had access to water but were not absorbing it efficiently because of heat, stress, and electrolyte loss. An electrolyte packet dissolved in a single cup of water costs less than 50 cents. It takes seconds to prepare. It requires no refrigeration, no cooking, no equipment. The packets last 2 to 4 years unopened. Children are more vulnerable to electrolyte imbalance than adults. Elderly family members are significantly more vulnerable. Anyone with a medical condition that affects kidney function or blood pressure needs to understand their specific requirements. But for the average healthy adult, having 20 to 30 packets stored costs almost nothing and provides a level of physiological support that most people would never think to include until the moment they need it. Number 6. Here is where the list begins to move from comfort into something more fundamental. The item is a manual can opener, not electric. Not a fancy chef's tool with 18 functions. A basic, reliable, hand-powered can opener. This sounds like it cannot possibly need explaining. But the reality of how most American kitchens operate tells a different story. A survey conducted by the American Red Cross found that a meaningful percentage of households that had canned food stockpiled also lacked a manual can opener. Because in normal life, can openers are electric, or people use pull-tab cans exclusively, or they simply cannot remember where the manual opener is, if they ever owned one. During Hurricane Florence in 2018, local emergency shelters reported people arriving with bags of canned food and no way to open any of it. Canned food that cannot be opened is not food. It is metal. Canned food is arguably the most important category of long-term pantry storage. Commercially canned goods from major brands last 2 to 5 years at standard shelf temperature, sometimes longer. They require no refrigeration. They are already cooked. Many can be eaten directly from the can without heating, though heating improves palatability and safety perception significantly. Canned beans, canned vegetables, canned fish, canned soup, canned fruit. These are the backbone of any serious emergency pantry. And the single item that unlocks access to all of it, in the absence of electricity, is a $5 hand tool that most families cannot locate when they need it. Buy two, store one in the kitchen and one with your emergency supplies. Test it before you need it. That is not overcaution. That is paying attention to the way things actually fail. Number 5, cash. Physical paper currency in small denominations stored safely at home. This is where some viewers stop taking the list seriously. And that is exactly the problem. The United States has progressively moved toward a cashless payment infrastructure. In 2023, the Federal Reserve's own consumer payment data showed that cash represented only about 18% of all consumer transactions, down from over 30% a decade earlier. Most people carry little or no cash. Most transactions happen through cards, phones, apps. The system works perfectly. Right up until the power grid fails, cell towers lose backup power, and every card reader in a 50-mile radius goes offline simultaneously. During the 2003 Northeast Blackout, still one of the largest in American history, affecting over 55 million people across the US and Canada, businesses that remained open during the first 12 hours operated on cash only. Gas stations that had fuel could not process cards. Grocery stores with food could not run registers. People who had cash bought things. People who did not have cash stood in line with full wallets and empty hands. This is not an argument against modern payment systems. It is a recognition that every digital system has a physical dependency somewhere in its chain. Power, signal, server. When that chain breaks, cash becomes the oldest and most reliable technology ever invented for exchanging value. A prepared household keeps $300 to $500 in small bills, 5s, 10s, 20s, stored somewhere secure at home. Not because they expect economic collapse, because they understand that a 72-hour power outage in a major city feels, commercially, exactly like a temporary local economic shutdown. Number 4, the list shifts here. The emotional weight begins to build. Number 4 is a hand crank or battery-powered emergency weather radio. In the age of smartphones and push notifications, this item sounds almost quaint. And that is precisely why it matters so much. The smartphone notification system depends entirely on cellular infrastructure, which depends entirely on power, which is exactly what a major crisis disrupts first. Cell towers run on backup batteries. Those batteries last 4 to 8 hours under normal load. Under emergency load, millions of people simultaneously trying to reach loved ones, stream information, access news. They last far less. After a major hurricane or ice storm or grid failure, cell service is often the second system to fail, right after grid power. The emergency weather radio operates on a completely different principle. It receives signals broadcast on dedicated NOAA weather radio frequencies, frequencies that have been operational since 1994, that broadcast continuously 24 hours a day, that carry official emergency alerts from the National Weather Service, FEMA, and local emergency management agencies. These broadcasts continue through situations where every digital system around them has gone dark. They run on batteries that can last weeks if used intermittently. The hand crank versions require no batteries at all. 90 seconds of cranking provides 30 minutes of broadcast reception. During the 2011 Joplin tornado, which killed 161 people and destroyed a third of the city, survivors who had warning had meaningfully better outcomes than those who did not. The warning came through emergency radio systems. Not every family had a receiver. The families that did had minutes of additional preparation time. In tornado scenarios, minutes are not a small advantage. The radio also provides something harder to quantify, but equally important: information as a psychological anchor. In the absence of knowing what is happening, human anxiety fills the void with worst-case scenarios. Official information, even bad official information, is less destabilizing than no information. Knowing the storm will pass in 6 hours is different from not knowing anything for 6 hours. The radio gives families the ability to make decisions based on reality rather than fear. Number 3. The emotional peak begins here. Number 3 is something almost every person has used and almost no one has deliberately stored: water purification tablets, or alternatively, a portable water filter straw of the type made famous by brands like Life Straw. Fresh water is the single most critical survival resource, more important than food, more important than shelter in most temperate conditions, more important than almost everything else on this list combined. A human being can survive approximately 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water. In extreme heat or physical exertion, that window narrows to 24 hours. The human body communicates this need constantly and urgently, and without negotiation. The problem during a large-scale emergency is not usually that water disappears immediately. The problem is that water safety cannot be assumed. Municipal water systems lose pressure during extended outages, which allows contaminants to enter the supply. Flooding contaminates well water. Stored water in containers that were not properly sealed develops bacterial growth. The water may look clean. It may smell acceptable. It may still make a person dangerously ill. Water purification tablets, typically iodine or chlorine-based, cost less than $15 for a supply that can treat hundreds of gallons. They weigh almost nothing. They last for years sealed. A filter straw from a reputable manufacturer can filter up to 1,000 gallons of water from lakes, streams, or contaminated municipal sources down to a level safe for consumption. These are not exotic items. They are sold in sporting goods stores, outdoor retailers, and online for prices that make their absence from most emergency kits genuinely difficult to explain. The moment water from a tap becomes questionable, every calculation in a household changes. What can we cook? What can we give the children? Can we trust what came out of that bottle? A water purification solution that costs $15 removes that calculation permanently. It is arguably the highest value per dollar item on this entire list. Number 2. This is the item most people do not discuss in preparedness content. It is not glamorous. It does not photograph well. It does not feel like survival gear. Number 2 is prescription medication. Specifically, a planned 30-day backup supply of any medication any family member takes regularly. According to the CDC, approximately 45% of Americans take at least one prescription medication regularly. Approximately 22% take 3 or more. These are not optional medications for most of the people taking them. They are blood pressure medications, thyroid regulators, diabetes treatments, psychiatric medications, asthma controllers, anticonvulsants, and dozens of other categories of drugs that a body comes to depend on in ways that cannot simply be paused. During Hurricane Katrina, one of the largest documented medical crises in a natural disaster was not trauma-related. It was the management of chronic disease in people who had left home without their medications, expecting to return in a day or two, and instead found themselves displaced for weeks. People in diabetic crisis, people in hypertensive crisis, people experiencing psychiatric emergencies, because antipsychotic or antidepressant medication had been abruptly discontinued. The medical literature on post-Katrina health outcomes documents these cases in detail that is genuinely sobering. Insurance systems in the United States make maintaining a medication backup difficult. Most insurance will not refill a prescription before the coverage window allows. But most insurance will refill slightly early, often 7 to 10 days before a prescription technically runs out. A family that refills consistently at the earliest possible moment builds a modest backup supply over several months without any additional cost. Some states and some pharmacies have emergency provisions that allow early refills during declared emergencies. But by the time a declaration happens, pharmacy shelves are already depleted. Talk to your doctor. Explain that you are trying to maintain a small emergency reserve. Many physicians will write an extra prescription for this purpose, particularly for life-sustaining medications. This is not a bureaucratic nuisance. This is the kind of preparation that saves lives in ways that an extra bag of rice never will. The medications that keep your family's physiology stable every day are the medications that become irreplaceable on day 3 of a disruption. Plan accordingly. Number 1. This is the one that nobody puts first. This is the one that does not come in a package or have a shelf life or get mentioned in any survival guide. Number 1 is a written, printed, physical document, stored somewhere accessible, containing the critical information your family needs to function if every digital system around you fails simultaneously. Think carefully about what that document needs to contain. Phone numbers. Not the numbers saved in a smartphone that may be dead or lost. The actual phone numbers of everyone who matters. Family members, neighbors, the family doctor, an out-of-state contact who can serve as a communication relay if local lines are overwhelmed. After 9/11, FEMA released guidance noting that out-of-state contacts were consistently easier to reach than local contacts during major regional emergencies, because local circuits were overwhelmed while long-distance lines had more capacity. Most families have no out-of-state contact plan. The document should also contain account numbers for medications and prescriptions, the location of important physical documents, birth certificates, insurance cards, passports, the deed to a house, and a simple household plan that every member of the family has read and understands. Where to go if the house is unsafe, who to call first, what to do if communication fails entirely, where the supplies are kept. This sounds bureaucratic. It is the furthest thing from bureaucratic. During the Camp Fire in 2018, the deadliest wildfire in California history, which killed 85 people and destroyed nearly 19,000 structures, the evacuation window for some communities was measured in minutes. People who knew where to go, who to call, and what to grab survived that window. People who did not make decisions under catastrophic stress with incomplete information. Some of those decisions cost everything. The average American family's critical information exists entirely inside smartphones, inside cloud accounts, inside digital systems that require both power and connectivity to access. A single printed document, updated twice a year, kept in a known location that every family member can identify, costs nothing except the time to write it. It is the foundation on which every other item on this list rests. The candles and the water and the medications and the cash are all meaningful, but without a plan, without a communication structure, without the knowledge of what to do, those items become props in a story with no script. Preparedness is not an extreme position. It is not a political statement. It is not fear. Every hospital has a backup generator. Every city hall has an emergency operations plan. Every airline pilot trains for scenarios that almost never happen. The preparation does not mean you believe disaster is inevitable. It means you understand that options expire, and the time to build options is before you need them. The families that survived recent American crises with the least suffering were not the wealthiest. They were not the most technically sophisticated. They were the ones who had thought one step further than the average, who had asked what happens if the power is out for 4 days, not one, who had asked what happens if the store is closed when we need something, who had answered those questions quietly and calmly, at a normal pace, before those questions became urgent. You have time right now. That is the thing most people never fully appreciate until they do not. The shelves are stocked. The prices are normal. The pharmacies are open. The hardware stores are calm. Every item on this list is available today at prices that will feel reasonable. Some of those items will not be available at any price on the first day that matters. The goal of this video was never to frighten you. The goal was to give you a specific kind of clarity, the kind that comes from looking honestly at how thin the margin is between a normal day and a difficult one, and deciding that the margin deserves respect. The question worth sitting with tonight is not whether any of this will happen. The question is whether, when it does, your family will be the one that has options, or the one standing in line hoping something is left. And if these 9 items represent what most families overlook before a crisis, the next question is equally important, and perhaps more surprising. What is the one thing people reach for in the first 6 hours after the power goes out that almost nobody has prepared for? That answer changes everything else on the list,
I didn't think were possible,
and it deserves its own conversation.
but I never gave up.